Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gail Peeney and I'm currently Acting Director of Heritage in the Department of Environment and Resource Management. I'd like to welcome you all here today to our presentation for Out of the Port, New Perspectives on Queensland History and Heritage. As is our practice, we always begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal people and the Yagara people, and pay our respects to their ancestors who came before them. Today we are pleased to be able to present Paddy Waterson, who will discuss the contribution the maritime industry has made to Queensland's historic development and explore the piecing together the work that DERM's currently doing of shipwreck sites to establish a more complete picture. Paddy is Queensland's appointed historical shipwreck practitioner and a Principal Heritage Officer with the Heritage Branch of DERM. He works throughout Queensland, but particularly in the far north, Wide Bay Burnett and southeastern districts. Initially trained as a general archaeologist and historian, Paddy has also completed postgraduate qualifications in forensic osteology and maritime archaeology. Following Paddy's presentation, there'll be an opportunity for questions. Please note that we are recording this talk, audio recording, for SLQ's website. If you have any questions, come and see myself or one of the staff. One last bit of housekeeping. If you need to leave during the talk, just use either one of the back exits and please switch off your mobile phones. Thank you. I'll just hand over to Paddy now.
Thank you. Promised myself I wouldn't trip over that, and the first thing I did was trip over that. Thanks very much for coming for today's talk. As Gail mentioned, just turn that light down a fraction, it's in my eyes. I want to talk today about the survey of Queensland's historic shipwrecks, and the survey's at two levels. One is an overview of the different varieties of wrecks, using some key examples along the coastline, to highlight what actually an historic shipwreck is, how we go about managing them, the kind of information that we're trying at the moment to gather. And secondly is to provide a bit more information about the actual historic shipwreck survey that the Heritage Branch and DERM is currently undertaking. So now I'll just see if I can... There we go. The reason I've sort of started with these slides is that there's a tendency for people to think that shipwrecks are somehow the exotic other. People tend to have images of treasure, of epic stories of tragedy. There's more than enough pictures I've seen of hard hat divers wrestling large squid, and there's a whole degree of romanticism about them. One of the things I want to talk to you about today is that while these things are part and parcel of the shipwreck heritage of Queensland, that these wrecks actually litter the coastline, and they're more common than you think. And the reason I've put these ones up there, I'm just trying to see if I can work out how to use the... Yep, there we go. Many of you might be familiar with the site of the SS Dickey at Caloundra. There it is when it first, well, soon after it went ashore. And that wreck survived on the beach for a very long time, and in fact people used to hold social events and balls on the wreck, get dolled up, walk down the beach and have a dance. And they did that for quite some time until eventually we see the wreck in that state. This is the wreck of the Normanby on Moreton Island. It was another different type of wreck. It was used in Queensland, in southeast Queensland, as part of the sugar industry. And it eventually ended its life not because of any great calamity, but because eventually it reached the end of its serviceable life and was abandoned. So just to clarify exactly what is an historic shipwreck, I'll get through all this very, very quickly if I can. Basically, a historic shipwreck is any wreck that is basically the wreck of any navigable vessel, and it must be, as a blanket rolling date, 75 years from that event. So the event can be the calamitous accidental loss of a ship, but it can also be when the ship was abandoned or scuttled. So it includes a broad range of vessels, not just those that were lost through accident. It also includes the artefacts that were on those ships, and that may even been collected prior to the material being removed. So not legal salvage, but if people have taken mementos from those sites, once that wreck becomes automatically protected, once it reaches that 75th anniversary, then the material that was taken from the wreck is also included. And there also can be specific declarations of wrecks younger than 75 years. And obviously the most recent example of that in Queensland is the Centaur. So the hospital ship that was sunk off Caloundra, when it was discovered earlier last year, it was younger than 75 years, which is the blanket protection date for historic shipwrecks. But because of the significance of the site, there was an obvious decision taken to make a declaration of that wreck. So how many wrecks are there? That's how many wrecks there are. There's about 1,050 historic shipwrecks along the Queensland coast. They're all up. There's about 1,400, 1,500. Obviously the number varies a little bit, but there's about 1,400 or 1,500 wrecks in total along the Queensland coast, and 1,050 of those already satisfy the criteria. I remember when I first showed this map to some of the staff at the mapping centre, the land centre, and they basically said, you don't need the map of Queensland, you can pretty much work out where it is based upon the number of wrecks. Now the ones in red are the ones that we don't have great information for. So you get an idea that we've actually only got good information for about 7% of the 1,050 wrecks along the Queensland coast, and a reasonable amount of information probably for about another 10%. Now, there are some wrecks around Australia that are under the Commonwealth Historic Shipwrecks Act have been declared to have protected zones around them. And these zones aren't necessarily to prevent access, but they do try to control access. So you can see in Queensland we actually have 10 wrecks in 9 zones, and what these zones do, these protected zones, is provide a heightened level of protection. So there's stronger penalties for damaging those sites, and you're required to get a permit. The permits are free, anyone can apply, but we can condition people's behaviour. So as an example, one of the wrecks I'll be talking about today is the SS Young Gala, which many people may have seen. It celebrated, well not celebrated, it commemorated the loss of its loss in just March. It gets about 5,000 visitors. About 5,000 people dive that wreck a year, and they do so under a permit structure. So it's not about stopping people from seeing these sites, but it is about controlling behaviour. And one of the things we do with the Young Gala is to limit that people cannot penetrate into the wreck. The reason I'm talking today is because there have been some recent changes to the administration of shipwrecks in Queensland. And as of July last year, so DERM, which is an acronym for the Department of Environment and Resource Management, I just usually say I'm from the Heritage Branch, we became the delegate under the Historic Shipwrecks Act. Now that was previously held by the Queensland Museum, who many of you recall had done a great deal of work over the last 20 or more years on sites like Pandora and the Young Gala and others. The reason for that was to try and bring all of maritime heritage into one administration. They had been responsible for wrecks under the Commonwealth legislation. We had been responsible for wrecks under the state legislation. And so the whole process is about bringing the control under one department, having legislation that is very consistent. So there's a blanket 75-year protection for wrecks no matter where they are. And it also enables us to bring that heritage, the shipwreck heritage, into the broader heritage umbrella. Because often people tend to think of shipwrecks as something out there and the lighthouses are something on the shore. And really they're part of the same landscape. So I'll get through this and then we'll get on to some of the more visually appealing sort of stuff. But the reasons we should care about shipwrecks are a whole range of things. But one of the things is there's practical reasons. As I indicated, tourism. Queensland has the largest dive tourism industry in Australia. They have a high degree of recreational value. Outside that tourism site, there are any number of divers that visit these sites for recreational purposes. A lot of these wrecks are located within our marine and national parks, and so are protected under that legislation as well. Safety is an interesting one because a lot of people don't appreciate that some of the wrecks do present severe safety issues. Some in terms of navigation hazards, but some because, say for instance in World War II, some of these vessels went down with live ordnance. So there's a wreck in the Northern Territory that is called the Florence D. It's had a zone declared around it simply because it was carrying thousands and thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft munitions when it was sunk. Some of these sites have a material that is of great financial value, artefacts. I mean, we're tending not to think of treasure, but in terms of artefacts and material on those. And even some of the materials that were there. So, I mean, in the 60s and 70s, it was quite common for people to blow wrecks apart to get to the brass and the copper. So they would literally go down with explosives. And they also become an important part of the natural environment. These wrecks, a lot of wrecks become really, really valuable and quite important artificial reefs, supporting large amounts of life. And you'll see some pictures of those soon. The other sort of reasons in terms of moral and academic is that a lot of the times there's great potential for human remains. A lot of these sites are related to great tragedies, and they do still contain, some still do contain human remains. Even those that perhaps still don't contain human remains, there's still a site of where people died. They're also a key source of historical information. Often things survive under the sea in certain environments that don't survive on land. So we find information about our history that, because these wrecks become frozen in time, and if they're left intact and are excavated in the correct way, we can find information that we just don't get on land. They've also got a lot of individual and collective value, simply because a lot of these sites, if we're looking at understanding Queensland's early shipbuilding industry, then we need to have a good selective sample of these sites to understand how they adapted traditional shipbuilding techniques to Australian hardwoods, which have quite different properties to those that they would have historically worked with. The other important thing is that the full extent, as you saw from that map, is we just don't know exactly where all these sites are. And from an archaeological perspective, we're always getting new techniques. So we couldn't dream 30 years ago of being able to use of the technology and equipment that's currently available, and I'm sure that in another 30 years' time, probably less than that, archaeologists will be using equipment that is not even conceived of today. And most importantly, these sites belong to all of Queensland. So in terms of the types of shipwrecks, one of the things I wanted to talk about today, and the way I'll structure things, is to try and look at some different types of wreck sites along the Queensland coast. But there are, as I said, there's those classic historical accidents, but there's those abandoned and scuttled hulks, but there's also some that were deliberately sunk for one reason or another, whether they were trying to create a protective reef, whether they were shoring up the land, or whether they're conducting land reclamation, and of course we've got modern shipwrecks, more recent shipwrecks that we have to take into account when we're looking at material. So when we think about shipwrecks and those classic images, one of the things we obviously think of is the age of exploration. This is an image that I took up in Cairns of the replica of the Divecon, which was the first vessel that's been documented as first European vessel that's documented as making landfall in not only in Queensland but Australia in 1606. Now, these sorts of sites, I mean, the Divecon actually didn't wreck, but these early mariner sites are often what create a great deal of interest. But in reality, the vast majority of those wrecks that you see along the Queensland coast are actually related to the historical development of the colony and later the state of Queensland. So some of you may have seen this image before. This is Brisbane in 1888. So you can see a few features like the Treasury Building, the Parliament House, the commissariat store, and over here, the Storybridge Hotel before there was a Storybridge. So, but one of the things that you notice immediately about this is that Brisbane had a very close association with the river and had a very prominent maritime trade and industry. The wharves all the way along here, so the museum and the library where we are along here, when you looked along there, there were wharves all the way along, all the way down there, and then all the way down towards Hamilton. Other sites along the Queensland coast were also developed as ports. So Rockhampton, you can see it was developed in the early 1850s, Maryborough in the late 1840s, Cairns, which was originally founded in 1876, this is an image taken in 1890, but all these centres that are along the Queensland coast are there so that they can enable materials and valuables, resources to get out and for people to get in. Now, one of the problems that Queensland had when it became an independent colony in 1859 is that it had one lighthouse. Very few navigation aids, quite poor charts of what is a very tortuous coastline with lots of offshore islands, the Great Barrier Reef. And so you've got a lot of navigation moving up and down the coast and very limited aids for those vessels to be able to passage safely. You can see here the quote. This is actually an extract from a Marine Board inquiry report into the loss of a vessel you'll see in a moment called the Aarhus. And it wasn't the master of the vessel that was lost, but it's another master that they were called. And he actually regarded Moreton Bay, or Cape Moreton, as one of the worst ports to enter. And you'll see in a moment why. So this is Moreton, North Stradbroke. There's Cape Moreton, and you can see the collection of wrecks concentrated around the entrance to the bay. There's also another concentration here, which is originally South Passage, and initially that was the passage that a lot of the vessels tried to use to get into Moreton Bay. And many of you know South Passage. It's quite a dangerous bit of water. It's relatively shallow. The sand moves quite a lot, so the channel can vary quite a bit. And when you're travelling under sail, if the wind drops or if the wind picks up dramatically and you're not able to manoeuvre accurately or quickly enough, you can run into some real problems. And you can see there's another concentration of wrecks around that passage as well. One of the things that when you actually go to visit these sites that you come to realise is that these sites aren't sitting proud on the ocean floor. These wrecks break up. They deflate. Now, the Aarhus was an iron bark, so it's a vessel that's constructed out of iron, and you can see some of how the structural members and the sheeting have survived. But they break up. The water impacts upon them, the actual stresses and forces of the water. So you don't find a pristine wreck on the bottom of the ocean. Well, normally you don't find a pristine wreck. What you find is a wreck that is breaking up, that's deflated, that's scattered. Another great example of this is the Young Australia. Now, this is again at Cape Moreton, and this vessel was wrecked in 1872. It was originally built as an American clipper ship, and it basically was one of those issues where I'm just trying to find the extract here. The wind suddenly dropped off. A heavily easterly swell and a strong southerly current sent the ship toward the rocks at the north point of the island. So that you can actually see the wreck. This is quite an unusual event for us in that we actually have photographic evidence of the wreck event itself. This is the ship when it struck Cape Morton. So there's quite dramatic tales of people having to get off the vessel, onto shore, and then try and make their way down to the pilot station. But this wreck has very heavily been salvaged and then broken up. And so now you can find small pieces of the wreck in and amongst the rocks and in the debris up at Cape Morton, spread all over. Now, this is one of the sites that many people will be very familiar with, which is, as I said before, the SS Young Gala. Now, this was quite a luxurious vessel for its time, and was one of the main coastal freighters. So it took passengers, it took cargo, and it did a run basically from Melbourne all the way up to Cairns and back again. It went missing in a cyclone in 1911. At the time, unfortunately, it did not have radio communications. It was actually waiting on its Marconi wireless radio at the time. It was waiting for it to be delivered and fitted. So it went past, made its way up the north coast, basically ran into a cyclone and was lost with all hands. So 122 people completely disappeared. Small amounts of wreckage washed ashore, and they had a reasonable idea where in the vicinity where it had gone down, but they had no way of knowing exactly where. So you can see Young Gala there. It's off Cape Bowling Green, just south of Townsville, so it was just south of making its next stop. The Young Gala wasn't located again until just after World War II. And when they found it, they basically found her laying slightly on her starboard side. Top of the wreck is in about 16 metres of water, and the bottom is in about 29 metres of water. Now, I'm just trying to see if I can... Those images, they're the Queensland Museum images. They haven't come up as well as I would have liked, but one of the things that you can clearly see on these is the level of coral. This has become very quickly, by the time people were able to find this site, it had become encrusted with both soft and hard corals. And the wreck, you can sort of see the diver there heading down. It's complete. That rough surface is just all coral. Supports a large amount of marine life, spectacular amounts of giant trevally, which are spectacular to look at but really annoying when they chase the bait fish in front of your camera, just as you've got that really nice shot. Now, one of the things that you'll see now is that as part of the role in DERM is that we recently went out. This is a site that there's a number of commercial operators that are permitted to go out and to take people out to. Cyclone Yasi, when it went through North Queensland recently, had quite a substantial impact upon this wreck, even in those depth of waters. What it basically did was basically churned up the sand and effectively sandblasted the wreck. So you can see that what was completely encrusted with coral is now back to almost bare metal. So for almost the first time that since people have been able to dive on this site, we're actually getting to see very clearly a lot of the structural material on the surface of the wreck itself. It's also causing certain amounts of material to actually come out of the wreck. And when we went and did the inspection dive on this site after Cyclone Yasi, the reason these are quite green is because the visibility was down to about 7 metres. So you literally can't see any further than 7 metres in front of you just because of the amount of material in the water. Also, but one of the things there, I don't know if you can read it, but that brick says Campbell's. It's part of the ballast that's come out of the front bow of the ship. And what's happened also during Cyclone Yasi is that this wreck has also rolled slightly more, I estimate about 15 degrees more towards starboard, but it's also caused some minor tearing, and as you can see here, quite a degree of buckling in places. One of the things we're now trying to work on is to get quite a detailed, what they call a bathymetric multi-beam survey, which is a fancy way of saying we're going to get a sonar system that can take very detailed recordings of the wreck and compare that to one that was taken a couple of years ago, so we can actually quantify the degree of movement and change in some of the parts of the wreck. So you can see there's a porthole. This is actually leading up. If you go back, you can see that section there is that section that you're seeing there. So the work that we're doing with these sites is not just about finding them, but also about ongoing management, because the concern we have is that obviously as the ship has been severely affected by the storm, it's going to increase the rate of deterioration because the coral actually helps to protect the metal of the ship. So now that the metal is re-exposed, it will begin to deteriorate more quickly. The coral will re-establish itself, but the damage will be done in the interim. And of course, what were the deck beams, because the vessel has rolled, the deck beams are now virtually acting as stanchions and holding up the wreck. They're under a lot of pressure, and because of the movement of the wreck, they're also starting to warp somewhat. So you're getting a whole range of issues that we're now trying to look at how we're going to manage this site. Nearby to the Young Gala is another wreck called the Gothenburg. Now, the Gothenburg was a major disaster in its time. It was a vessel that was actually travelling from Darwin down to Melbourne and had on it quite a number of people who had gone to Darwin for official business. The vessel basically struck... Sorry, I'll just read this little section here. In February 1875, the vessel anchored in Albany Pass. On the 20th of February, the Gothenburg parted from its chains and lost its bower anchors. The vessel continued on southward through the inner route, and on the 23rd, Cape Cleveland was sighted at a distance of approximately 10 to 12 miles. The weather was squally with heavy seas, and the vessel was travelling at full speed. Just as the sea was observed to be getting smoother, the Gothenburg ran aground on the southern edge of detached reef off the entrance to Flinders Channel. All attempts to refloat the vessel off the reef were unsuccessful, and early on the 24th, the vessel began to bump heavily on the reef. The ship's boats were lowered, however, two accidentally became adrift and were not able to get back to the Gothenburg, and the third boat capsized. The Gothenburg was swung around, broadside on the reef, gradually heeling over to port as the tide fell, exposing the deck to the action of the sea, which swept a number of people from the ship. The Gothenburg continued to break up, with the remaining passengers and crew on board. The steamer Leichhardt recovered those on board the first boat, which had drifted away. It returned them to Bowen and then made for the Gothenburg. When it arrived, only a portion of the mast of the Gothenburg could be seen above the water. A total of 103 lives were lost, including all 25 women and children and all of the officers. Now, this is a site that, again, has a protected zone declared around it, and it's a site that we've been looking to manage. So you can see it's very close, again, to Young Gala, just south of Townsville. Now, hopefully these will stand out. So one of the things that we're doing as part of the new sort of arrangements is that we're working more collaboratively with Marine Parks, which is also part of the same department. This is a photo of the double boilers on the Gothenburg, taken a number of years ago by the Queensland Museum. Quite recently, Queensland Parks and Wildlife Rangers were going out doing some reef check work. They said, we know that we're going to be near the Gothenburg, would you like us to do an inspection? We said, yes, please. We gave them a series of photos and the management plan and some instructions, and they were able to take that photograph, virtually from the exact same position. So what we're able to do is to actually compare those over time, look at the degree of change, look at the impacts that are going on, because this is a relatively shallow site in 16 metres. You can notice straight away that a lot of the coral, again, has been abraded. We've had quite a number of cyclones through that area, including Larry. This was before Cyclone Yasi. And due to the loss of that coral, you can see there's also been an increase in some of the deterioration. So again, the same picture, a different photograph of the boilers by the Queensland Museum, and the same photograph taken recently by Marine Parks. I was talking before about deck beams. these are the deck beams from the Gothenburg, and they're actually the fact that they're sitting up like this is an indication of how the wreck has sprawled open and broken up. That's the stern of the vessel, and again, these are recent photographs taken virtually from the same angles. So you can see in this instance, quite a bit more coral has established itself. So we're able to do regular monitoring, see how these sites are going, see if they need any active intervention to try and arrest some of any deterioration. We can look at the impacts of cyclones on them. We can try to manage them more actively. Other historic accidents involve, of course, not just cyclones or uncharted reefs, but floods. And we're all very familiar with the impact of the recent floods on Brisbane. Well, this is actually 3 vessels that were washed into the Brisbane Botanic Gardens in 1893 during the floods in Brisbane. So the Paluma is actually a government, it was part of the Queensland Navy. Queensland had its own colonial navy prior to becoming part of Australia. And the Paluma was a gunship that was also used for survey work. It was undergoing a refit in the river. It was basically ripped from its moorings during the flood. An 1893 flood was probably the largest recorded flood that Brisbane's known. If you go down to Needham House towards the financial district, down towards the stock exchange, and you'll see Needham House. There's an anchor there, and there's the flood marks on the side of it. And 1893 is sitting way up, quite high. And it literally picked these vessels up and washed them into the Botanic Gardens, where you can see this photograph taken now. These are not small vessels, these are very large vessels. Now, the 1893 flood experience was such that they actually had 3 peaks over a period of time. And so when the flood peaked again, they floated them out. So they actually used another vessel to help, but they actually pulled it out. So in 1893, the floodwaters rose on 3 occasions within relatively close time frame, and so they were able to get the vessels out. So that's the front of the Paluma. You can see there its gun deck. You can see the scale, the people and everything working around it, how large these vessels are. Another example of a vessel lost in flood is the SS Brenna in Mackay. It's a classic example of what we'd call a little coastal river lighter. A lot of the ports in Queensland were relatively shallow, and so they had often deeper water ports nearby, and they would use these smaller vessels to take goods, material, passengers from the main settlement, or conversely from a smaller wharf into the main settlement. So Mackay, the Pioneer River, not being particularly deep, had a more substantial port out of one of the offshore islands, and the Brenna was one of those that used to take passengers and goods in and out. Now, in 1918, a massive cyclone hit Mackay and caused extensive damage. It also coincided with a huge amount of rain, which caused what they described at the time as a tidal wave, and that's the official record describes it as a tidal wave that came down the river, ripped the Brenna from its moorings, smashed it into the Pioneer Bridge. The 3 members on board, the captain, the mate, and one of their sons, managed to climb off the vessel and onto the bridge and run onto the side before the middle span of the bridge actually collapsed due to damage from the collision, right onto the Brenna. And this photo here is actually, there's the Brenna, there's the section of one of the sections of bridge, and they then had to repair it. So the Brenna was effectively ended up there. In the 1920s, they built a training wall, a big rock wall over it. And then a couple of years ago, Main Roads went to do the new bridge across the Pioneer River, went down to do the first pylon and started bringing up material. So you can see the compass and one of the decorative legs that would be supporting the compass. So they've gone down pretty much onto the bridge of the vessel. And so at the time, a colleague of mine went up, spoke to them, they did some management work, they got maritime archaeologists involved, they got a management plan in place, they recovered what material they could. That was then sent to the Queensland Museum and it was conserved. But there is still other remnants of that wreck still sitting down underneath. Now around the Gold Coast, we've got what are often referred to as the whisky wrecks, the famous whisky wrecks. This is a good example. The Scottish Prince is a good example of a couple of elements. Again, you can see that's the vessel, how it originally looked. It's a wooden bark. You can see now that's probably one of the most prominent pieces of the wreck that's visible under the water. The sand again is shifting so much that a section of that wreck will appear for 2 days and then disappear for another 5 years. The wreck occurred, basically the official finding was that the captain just navigated too close to the south end of Stradbroke Island and ran aground. The vessel eventually broke up because it's in shallow water and in stern seas. So, I mean, most of these events are going to be a combination of factors, but one of the common factors, because we are all human, is human error. One of the other things that we need to consider when we're looking at a lot of these wreck sites is that they were actively salvaged. So there was salvage work undertaken at the time, and there's been salvage work of one kind or another done since. So these are actually 2 anchors from the Scottish Prince that were recovered a number of years ago, and they're now sitting outside SeaWorld. So, but it was quite uncommon. It was quite common for these sites to be actively salvaged at the time. So there would actually be a public auction. There would be notices in the newspaper. They would actually sell the salvage rights to these ships, and people who bought those rights would actively go in and recover what they could. It's not simply cargo, but it's rigging, it's rope, it's fittings, it's a whole range of things that they could make money from. And so quite often, if these wrecks occurred in areas that were accessible and were known, then they will have had a degree of salvage work done. The other of the famous whisky wrecks is the Canvas Wallace. And it's an iron bark that sank in 1894. Now, one of the reasons at this site is it was lost due to a whole range of factors. Basically, if I can bear with me while I read just a section, but it left Glasgow on its maiden voyage on the 3rd of May, 1894, bound for Brisbane with general cargo. The vessel had been allowed to go kilometres off course, and during a southeast gale, the ship was driven ashore on Stradbroke Island, about 17 miles of Point Lookout. 22 of the crew, including the captain, managed to get ashore. However, 1 crew member died later that day, and 5 of the crew drowned. The steward is believed to have drowned in his cabin. A large portion of the cargo was washed ashore, including explosives. Now, one of the great stories about the Canvas Wallace is that in the process of doing the salvage, people were going out that a lot of these wrecks were carrying large quantities of alcohol, whiskey. And one of the great stories, true or not, is that the explosives were used to try and recover some of that material. It destabilised the dunes and actually led to the establishment, or the sea breaking through between North and South Stradbroke Island, effectively creating South Stradbroke Island. What is certain is that, yes, explosives were detonated, and it's likely that that was probably done just as a safety precaution rather than anything else. Whether that contributed to the actual dune, I'm not in a position to the establishment of the sea getting through. I'm not in a position to say, but certainly it's one of those great stories about how these wrecks came to influence our environment. Now, some of the other vessels that have become wrecks around Brisbane were deliberately scuttled. Now, this is a picture of the government yacht Lucinda. Now, in the days when transport was not easy around the state, rail networks were reasonably limited and were only developing, roads were limited, uncomfortable and slow. The government maintained a vessel which was at the disposal of the governor, the premier, of other government officials to actually move up and down the coast. It was the quickest, it was the most comfortable way for them to do that. And they had a succession of government vessels. Now, Lucinda was one towards the late 19th and early 20th century. Lucinda's great claim to fame, apart from anything else, is that this vessel was taken down into New South Wales for a Premier's meeting, and on it was actually drafted a substantial proportion of the model for the Australian Constitution. Such an important wreck, or such an important vessel, I should say, was sold out of government use in 1923 and became a coal hulk. So it went from being the pride of the Queensland government to being a coal hauler, and eventually in 1937 it was completely decommissioned and abandoned as a hulk on Bishop Island. Bishop Island and Fisherman's Island became very well known and established sites for the dumping of wrecks. There were a large number of vessels that were deposited there, and you can see a whole range of wrecks in and amongst there. Of course, these sites have since become part of Queensland Port and Queensland Airport, so they've become an active part of that land reclamation process and are now actually underneath land. I mentioned before the gunship Paluma. This was its sister ship, which was the flagship of the Queensland Navy, the Guyunda. It too went out of service. It became a gravel barge, I think, from memory. And in fact, this extra section on the bow was actually added to facilitate that purpose. Years later, it was deliberately abandoned at Woody Point to help provide shore protection. These are actually ship's boilers that were developed as part of a land reclamation and shore protection along Brisbane at Kangaroo Point. These were exposed during the 2000s. Brisbane City Council went to do some work and they suddenly found some ship's boilers. From the artefacts that were found in and around them and from the type of material, so we could give them a rough date for when they went in, and we could look at them and we knew that by that stage they were obsolete. They were older model boilers and they seemed to be very clearly used for that purpose of shoring up the bank. More recently, there have been a number of wrecks in Moreton Bay, and of course they're still happening, but there are a number of wrecks that potentially of significance even of a more recent age. So this is a vessel, a Danish barge that came to Brisbane in the 60s to undertake some major dredge works. It was a suction dredge. Suction head, the theory is that the suction head was removed while the vessel was unstable and the vessel capsized. Now, I think from memory, 16 members of the crew were actually trapped inside that wreck. Only a year before, the Queensland Water Police had actually developed a dive unit. And a member of the Queensland Water Police dive team, plus a commercial diver, Joe, now I'm not going to probably pronounce his name correctly, but Joe Engwerder, actually worked for 11 hours to get the crew members out. They successfully rescued 12 of the 16, which at the time was a world record, and basically justified the establishment of the Water Police dive team. So there's the vessel as it was turned over. They eventually righted the barge, conducted a small amount of salvage, and then it was towed back to Europe. Now, one of the sections that actually was left behind is this Wheelhouse. And it's still sitting in Moreton Bay. The irony is that the site of this, because the actual vessel was taken away, there was quite a number of people who knew that the site was there. It's fantastic fishing. You can see the brim. At other sites, commercial fishermen knew there was something there because they had it on their marks and their charts because they were catching their nets. But the actual site of where that particular, and it's also away from where the incident occurred. So this Wheelhouse that's actually upside down, you can see that's why you've got all the cabling and material. They've literally cut it off and dumped it over the side. This is still sitting out there in Moreton Bay, and it was only recently that the official records were updated to indicate its location. Other people did know where it was, but the official records weren't marked, and now it's also been listed with the Hydrographic Service. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a taste of the different types of wreck sites that are out there, some of the difficulties in finding and locating the sites, because they're not always sitting proud of the ocean floor. They're often broken up, deflated. Often only elements of the wreck survive. And so when DERM took over the delegation, or when DERM received had the delegation transferred to them, I should say, in midway through last year, one of the things we wanted to do was to update the official records. And so one of the things that we've done is developed a shipwreck survey. So it's a 5-year project, and it's concentrating on the East Coast simply because that's where we have the most resources, and because the Torres Strait and the Gulf of Carpentaria have quite unique operating conditions. That being said, we will be looking to do some work in those areas, but not perhaps the targeted field work. We're going to be working our way up a number of zones up the East Coast. We're not trying to identify everything. We're not trying to pick up every one of the 1,050 shipwrecks. We simply can't. A lot of these sites are in very, very deep water. The Centaur is in very deep water off the shelf. So it's not about trying to solve every mystery, and it's not about trying to find every site. It's about trying to bring this funny little acronym, it's the Australian National Shipwreck Database. It's about bringing that database as up to date and making it as accurate reflection of what information is out there about the shipwreck sites as possible. As you can see, the funding, it's not a huge amount of money, particularly when you consider it over 5 years. A lot of the funding is about trying to engage with the community and do those targeted field work in each area. So we're not going to be doing massive amounts of field work. We'll do some limited field work in areas we feel we can get very good results. And there is certainly scope for community institutional involvement in all phases, but in particular, we're trying to appeal to people to provide information. So one of the reports from the public just very recently was a wreck that, again, Cyclone Yasi took about, you can see here the high level of erosion, took about between 20 and 30 metres of sand off Ramsay Bay in Hinchinbrook Island. This is right where the eye of the cyclone went through. Cardwell is on the other side of Hinchinbrook Island. It had a massive impact, took away a huge amount of sand on the beach and exposed the top 2 or 3 inches of the outline of a wreck. From what we know, this is not a site that's been known by locals in living memory, and was probably under, the bow of the ship would have been under the dune. So it's been there for quite some time. There are a number of wrecks in that area that it could possibly be. There are at least 5 that we're looking at, and 3 that we know that were driven ashore between 1879 and 1880, ironically trying to recover cedar that had been washed ashore from another shipwreck, the Merchant. So we've been trying to pull together documentary information. You can see here one of the vessels that we've been looking at is the Bell, and this is an historical record called Lloyd's Register of British and Foreign Shipping. You can see that there's a number of vessels named the Bell. This is the one, and it provides a whole range of information, including its dimensions, the tonnage. We know that it's yellow metal and it's part iron bolted, which means the top half of the deck, the top half of the ship above the waterline has got iron bolts because it's cheaper, and then below the waterline they're using copper alloy. It's more durable in the water. We also know, importantly, where it was surveyed. So they would do a large amount of work on these vessels to basically assess them when they were constructed. They would do a survey so that if people wanted to buy, sell, insure those ships, they would have accurate information about how that ship was constructed, its capacity, how long it's been since it was serviced, and any modifications made. So they would make a number of these over the years. So we've actually been able to identify where the original surveys were done, and now we've written back to the National Maritime Museum in London, and they have been able to confirm that they hold the original survey records for those vessels. So we're able to know what timbers were used in what parts of the ship, what type of bolts were used in what part of the ship, the exact construction techniques. And so we'll then be able to try and compare that to the information we extract from the site and hopefully get a match, but it's not a guarantee. Other tools that we're using, believe it or not, are things like Google Earth. That little blob is actually the Roof is King. So in shallow water sites, intertidal sites, this sort of imagery, even high-resolution photographs from aircraft are useful. Other things that we'll be using are remote sensing. So when we do the limited fieldwork, we will be using some remote sensing techniques, one of which is magnetometry. So believe it or not, this is the very first image they had of the Centaur. So a magnetometer picks up anomalies in the magnetic field. And because you've got high large amounts of ferrous metal, in many of these vessels, it can identify these magnetic anomalies and give you targets that you can go and investigate. One of the other techniques that you can then use to follow up is side-scan sonar. Now, this is not the Centaur, but you can see there are two wrecks there. This is from a site in Victoria. And you can see that there are two wrecks there, and it gives you a much higher level of detail about the orientation. You can take measurements and a whole range of things. I've been told I'm running out of time, so I'll just skip through. But the outcomes we're trying to do out of the survey is to try and get not only better management plans, but better public information. It belongs to all of Queensland. We want people to be able to enjoy these sites. We want to be able to encourage dive tourism and other things in responsible ways. So we're trying to pull together a whole range of information. It's about setting up a good baseline of data from which we can direct future research and also enable the public to be able to access the sites. So far, this was the little chart that we saw before. In August last year, we only had about 6 sites within Moreton Bay that the official records, and I must stress the official records indicated we only had exact positions for. We've now jumped to at least 18, and that was January, so we've gone past that already. And we're about to start the field work in May, largely concentrating on this area up here for obvious reasons. So how can you help? Well, you can go to, that's the website there, but it's easy. It's just environment.gov.au. You'll see the links to heritage and historic shipwrecks. And that's where the Australian National Shipwreck Database is. And it's a web-based resource that not only provides information but allows you to submit information. It's still being developed and updated all the time. But we are obviously looking for people to use that. The more that people use it and can identify any errors, problems, anomalies, can add information, the better. Pictures. Families hold a lot of historic photographs. There's some fantastic people, there's lovely photographs. There was one I was going to use, but I didn't, of people standing on the beach in the 1930s with a large wreck on the beach and everyone's posing nicely. Those sorts of shots can be extremely invaluable. Obviously, if you can, you visit a shipwreck and maritime heritage place. There are a number of museums along the Queensland coastline. There are a number of wrecks that are quite accessible to whether you dive or not. Join an advocacy group or a community group. There are a number of historical societies that do active research. There is the Maritime Archaeological Association of Queensland and a range of others, as well as the Volunteer Maritime Museum. And the last thing, of course, that we ask is that don't interfere with the wreck sites or take mementos, because it's a little bit like salami tactics, because if everyone takes a little bit, eventually the whole sausage is gone. And it's the same effect on these sites. There's also an email address that you can report information and a phone number that you can also report information if you have it. So that's my acknowledgements. Thank you very much for coming along. Hopefully it's been a little bit enjoyable. And if anyone's got any questions, I think Gal's chomping at the bit.
Yes, a wealth of information. We've got time for a couple of questions if people would like to ask Paddy any questions.
How rare are wrecks in modern times, given the advances in navigational science? I mean, are wrecks very much a thing of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century?
Sorry, I'm just going to repeat the question just so it gets on the recording. So the question is really about how rare shipwrecks are now, given advances in technology in navigation.
Well, I mean, they're still obviously occurring. From an archaeological perspective, one of the things is that we don't want them to stay there. We actually want them to be salvaged and removed, which is appropriate from an environmental perspective. But obviously it will have an impact, particularly in places like Australia, where maritime safety agencies and authorities actively want those sites removed and cleaned up. So certainly, as we move into the future, the number of wrecks that add, I suppose, to the archaeological record here will be less. But I think there will always be some. You've only got to see the amount of work that's happened with trying to locate vessels after the recent floods in Brisbane, with the amount of material that was, and also elsewhere up the Queensland coast. And in fact, when the Navy were going through in the Brisbane River, they were finding wrecks that had been sunk in 1974 that were still in the Brisbane River. So there's still an element there. Not all will be recovered, but certainly the really large vessels, the bulk carriers and stuff, are not likely to be. But I mean, even as early as late as the 60s and 70s, you had the Cherry Venture on the beach. Again, it was recently, or relatively recently, removed, but it was on the beach for quite a number of years.
Another question?
Immigration ships, particularly government immigration ships, had a deeper draft, a heavier draft. How many of them were involved in shipwrecks? How many of them found it against reefs and things like that?
Sorry, the question's about immigration ships and how many were involved in shipwrecks?
Yep. Look, certainly there's a number of wrecks, particularly in the 19th century, where you had large numbers of immigration to Australia, where wrecks were lost. There's one, ironically, not far from Ramsay Bay, just at the northern end of Ramsay Bay, the wreck called the Banshee, which was actually taking miners to the Palmer goldfield, that was lost there. So, I mean, certainly as we got into the 20th century and navigation instruments and those sorts of things were becoming more available, they were less likely to occur. But certainly there were quite a number of vessels that certainly were lost, and there's a number that I can think of in New South Wales and Victoria. I can't think of too many off the coast of Queensland, but I'm sure that they're there.
There's the Queen of the Colonies just off Caloundra somewhere, isn't there? That's one, in the 1860s?
Yeah, certainly in that 19th century, there's certainly a number of... And because places like Maryborough were ports of entry, and so you're not just coming into Brisbane, you're coming into a range of other sites. Certainly there's also vessels that were taking South Sea Islander labourers that were lost in a number of areas. So, yeah, there's a number of vessels, and there's also, I mean, in New South Wales there was one convict ship that was lost. So they're certainly there. I can't say off the top of my head exactly how many, but they would have been there for certainly.
I think we've got time for one more question, if anyone wants to ask.
The government ship, the Llewellyn, I noticed it appeared as a wreck on the screen there.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine's relative went down on the Llewellyn, and I believe it went down somewhere near St. Bees Island.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Has a wreck been located?
It has. And that's why...
Sorry, the question's just about whether the Llewellyn, a wreck, has been located.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the Llewellyn has been located, and it's had that's why it's had the protected zone declared around it. It's also it's one of those sites that's actually protected by its environment. You've got very big currents in the waters off Mackay, and diving is really quite difficult. So it's not one of those places that people often go to for recreational purposes. But certainly it has been fixed. There is some documentation of the site, and it is one of those that you do need a permit to go into there to traverse the area.
Okay, so thank you very much to Paddy. And I'm sure for those of you who do have more questions, he'd be happy to keep talking about some of these issues. And as we are aware, we are recording all these talks and they'll be available on the State Library of Queensland website page if you'd like to listen again. So next month, the Out of the Box series, there's an intriguing presentation by Dr. Jonathan Richards, and he's going to delve into the darker side of our coastline. I think we've already done some darkness, but even darker. So he'll be discussing fatalities on Queensland beaches and coastal waterways between 1890 and 1960. So should try and get along to that. And thank you all for coming. Take the time to pick up a copy of the State Library of Queensland What's On flyer, which is, I think, just outside the door, and it'll tell you more information about other events that are coming up at the State Library, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.